He took his seat in first class. Quiet, polite, ticket in hand. Nobody paid him any attention, not even the flight attendant, until she stopped, stared, and demanded he move. In front of everyone, she accused him of lying and slapped his hand, forcing him to the back of the plane. No one stood up for him. No one said a word. He didn't fight back, didn't shout, didn't cause a scene. He just picked up his phone and made one silent call. Within minutes, the flight was delayed. The crew began to panic, and the woman who thought she ran the cabin realized she had just humiliated the wrong person. What happened next shocked everyone on board and changed her life forever, before the wheels even left the ground. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next one. He boarded the plane quietly, dressed in a dark hoodie, clean sneakers, and neat jeans. Around his neck hung a pair of sleek headphones, and in his hand he held a slim black phone. His name was Owen. 17 years old, calm by nature, raised to never draw attention to himself. He walked down the aisle of the first-class cabin with confidence, but not arrogance. He wasn't showing off. He wasn't loud. He just knew this was his seat. 2A window view, just like he preferred. He placed his bag in the overhead bin, sat down, and pulled out a book. A few passengers glanced at him, then looked away. To them, he was just another teenager traveling alone. Owen didn't mind being invisible. He was used to it. A few minutes later, the flight attendant entered the cabin. Her name was Bridget, late 40s, crisp uniform, hair pulled into a tight bun. She moved down the aisle with sharp steps, pausing briefly to greet other passengers with practiced smiles. But when she saw Owen, her expression changed. Her steps slowed. Her eyes scanned him from head to toe. No smile this time. She stopped beside his seat and tilted her head. "Excuse me," she said, loud enough for others to hear. "Are you sure you're supposed to be here?" Owen looked up, confused. "Yes, Doe." Her arms folded. "Can I see your ticket, please?" He nodded and pulled it from his hoodie pocket. She snatched it without a word. Her eyes narrowed as she read it, then flicked back to his face, then to the ticket, then back to him again. "This is a first-class ticket," she said slowly. "I know," he replied. She paused. "Are you flying with someone?" "No." She blinked hard. "So, you're traveling alone? In first class?" Owen said nothing this time. He knew where this was going. Bridget leaned in slightly, her tone sharper. "I think there's been a mistake. You can't sit here. This seat is for first-class passengers only." Owen's chest tightened. "I am a first-class passenger." "Listen," Bridget snapped. "You're holding things up. I don't know how you got this ticket, but you need to move to the back. Now!" Owen stayed seated. His voice was calm. "This is my seat." Her jaw tensed. "Get up." When he didn't move fast enough, she reached for his phone resting on the armrest, and in the process her hand smacked his hand hard enough to make a loud slap. A few passengers gasped. One woman covered her mouth. A man nearby shifted uncomfortably in his seat, pretending to check his watch. But no one spoke. Owen stared at Bridget for a second, stunned. Not from pain, but from the sheer disbelief. Then he stood. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He just picked up his backpack, pulled his hood forward, and walked back down the aisle. All eyes followed. He found an empty seat in the very last row of the plane. The economy seat was smaller, tighter, with a broken armrest. He didn't care. He sat down, slid his phone into his lap, and took a deep breath. The soft vibration of a message buzzed against his hand. He unlocked the screen and typed one line. "She slapped my hand and kicked me out. I'm in the back." He hit send. Then he looked out the window. Outside, the runway stretched ahead like nothing had changed. But inside, something had. And Owen knew this wasn't the end. Not even close. Owen sat still, his eyes fixed on the scratched plastic of the window. The hum of the engines was low, steady, almost soothing. But his chest was tight. Not from fear, but from the kind of quiet anger that didn't explode. The kind that waited. He gripped the phone tighter in his hand. The message had been sent nearly 2 minutes ago, and still no reply. He wasn't nervous. He knew what would happen once it was read. In a high-rise office tower miles away, someone else's phone buzzed. The man behind the desk, broad-shouldered with short salt-and-pepper hair and a navy suit that looked like it cost more than most cars, read the message in silence. His name was Patrick Walker, billionaire, owner of several tech companies, investment firms, and, most importantly, the largest share in the airline Owen was currently sitting on. He was also Owen's father. Patrick didn't speak. He didn't raise his voice or slam a fist on the desk. Instead, he picked up his office phone and pressed a number he knew by heart. A soft tone beeped twice before a voice answered. "Yes, sir. Flight 672. I want eyes on it now. Seat 2A. There's been an incident." The voice on the other end responded without delay. "Understood." Patrick hung up and leaned back in his chair, the storm already moving behind his eyes. Back on the plane, Bridget returned to the galley, still feeling proud of herself. She poured herself a quick cup of coffee and leaned against the counter with a satisfied smirk. The teenage boy had been a disruption, plain and simple. These days, anyone thought they could buy their way into first class. The way he looked, the way he didn't say much. She just knew something wasn't right. She didn't feel guilty. Another attendant, younger, soft-spoken with a name tag that read Taylor, hesitated beside her. "Was there actually a problem with his ticket?" Taylor asked cautiously. Bridget rolled her eyes. "You saw him. Tell me he didn't look out of place." Taylor frowned. "But he had the right seat." Bridget gave a short laugh. "Probably borrowed the ticket from someone else. We can't have that kind of nonsense in first class. It sets the wrong tone." Taylor looked away, unsure what to say. A moment later, the intercom crackled overhead. "Bridget, please report to the cockpit." Her coffee froze halfway to her lips. She blinked. Taylor looked at her, puzzled. "That's strange." Bridget forced a smile. "Probably just a routine check." But deep down, a small flicker of doubt began to form in her stomach. She set the cup down and adjusted her uniform. As she walked up the aisle, she caught a few passengers watching her, some curious, some whispering quietly. She straightened her back and kept walking. The cockpit door was already open when she arrived. The captain turned to her, his face unreadable. "Close the door," he said flatly. She obeyed. And when the door clicked shut behind her, she knew something was wrong. Inside the cockpit, the atmosphere was nothing like Bridget expected. The captain, a man named Reese Hammond with 30 years in the air, wasn't smiling. He stood stiffly beside the control panel, arms crossed, his eyes locked on her with quiet intensity. Next to him, on the small screen mounted beside the radio system, was the live face of someone she didn't recognize, but whose voice hit harder than any turbulence. "Bridget," the man on the screen said. "I'm Richard Lane, Director of Flight Operations. We've received a call from Executive Command regarding a possible incident with a passenger in Seat 2. Bridget froze. "Yes, sir. There was a seating issue. I corrected it." "Did you check the ticket?" Yes, I saw it," she said, her throat dry. "It looked odd. And he wasn't on the list, so I assumed—" "You assumed," the man interrupted, his voice colder now. "Or did you verify?" "I didn't have time to confirm it with the manifest." The boarding process was moving quickly. Captain Hammond exchanged a look with the screen, then turned to Bridget. "You didn't follow procedure. You didn't call it in. And more importantly, you didn't recognize who that passenger is." Bridget's stomach twisted. "He was just a teenager." "No," the director said firmly. "That teenager is Owen Walker, son of Patrick Walker." Bridget blinked. I didn't know." "Well, now you do," the captain said, his tone hard. "And we've just received a direct instruction from Mr. Walker himself. This flight is not moving until this situation is addressed." Bridget took a step back, the words echoing in her head like a warning bell. We're being ordered to pause all operations, the director continued. You will personally apologize to Mr. Walker, in front of all passengers, and you will escort him back to his original seat. Then you'll return to the cockpit and await further instructions. But in front of everyone? She whispered. The captain nodded. You humiliated the wrong person, Bridget, and now you're going to make it right. Or you won't be flying again, not on this airline. Bridget's lips parted, but no words came. Her mouth was suddenly dry. The cockpit air, once cold, now felt suffocating. Without another word, she turned and opened the door. The moment she stepped back into the aisle, she felt it. The shift, the energy. People were watching. And for the first time, she wasn't sure what they were expecting her to do. But she had no choice. Bridget walked down the aisle like her shoes had gained weight. Every step felt heavier, slower. The smiles she once wore like armor had vanished. Passengers glanced up from their devices, whispers rising like smoke in the still air. Some leaned to get a better view. Others looked away, pretending not to watch, though every ear was wide open. She reached the back of the plane, eyes scanning until she saw him. Owen was still sitting in the last row, headphones around his neck, phone in his hand, looking out the window like none of this touched him. But Bridget could see the quiet tension in his shoulders. He knew. She stopped a few steps away and cleared her throat. Her voice didn't carry the same sharpness as before. Mr. Walker, she said, forcing a polite tone. There's been a misunderstanding. I'd like to escort you back to your original seat in first class. Owen didn't turn right away. He let her words hang in the air, unanswered. Passengers nearby turned toward them. A few even pulled out their phones. Bridget tried again, her voice softer. I want to apologize for the earlier incident. It wasn't handled properly. Owen finally turned to face her. His expression was calm, but his eyes, those sharp, focused eyes, watched her like he was measuring every word. A misunderstanding? He asked. Bridget nodded quickly. Yes, I misread the situation. You mean, he said slowly, you misread me. She shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't personal. You looked at me, Owen interrupted, voice steady, and you decided I didn't belong. You didn't ask anyone else in that cabin for their ticket. Just me. Bridget's mouth opened, but no words came out. He stood, still holding his phone. The nearby passengers were silent now, caught in the middle of something real, something raw. Owen adjusted the strap of his bag and stepped forward. I'll go back, he said, but not because you told me to, because it's my seat. Bridget gave a small, stiff nod and turned. Together they walked up the aisle, past rows of eyes, past passengers who now saw him differently. Not just a teenager, not just a kid in a hoodie. Someone with power, someone they had ignored. Owen reached his seat in 2A and sat down calmly. Bridget stood beside him, unsure what to say. If there's anything else you need, she mumbled, please let me know. Owen didn't respond. He simply picked up his book, flipped to the page he was on earlier, and began to read. And with that, the conversation was over. Bridget turned slowly and walked back down the aisle, her posture no longer upright and commanding. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached the galley, where Taylor stood silently, having witnessed every step of the apology. Bridget didn't meet her eyes. She picked up a tray, pretended to arrange cups, but her fingers fumbled. You all right? Taylor asked gently. Bridget didn't answer right away. She kept her eyes on the tray, organizing things that didn't need organizing. I handled it, she said finally, but her voice was brittle. Taylor said nothing. The silence between them spoke louder than any words. Bridget had always been the one who gave instructions, who reminded others of protocol, who held herself like she was untouchable. But now, she looked like a shadow of herself, stripped of certainty, covered in the weight of consequences. In first class, Owen sat still in his seat. His book was open, but he wasn't reading anymore. His mind was too busy, flipping through everything that had just happened. The slap, the stares, the silence, the forced apology, and the sudden shift in energy around him. People who had ignored him at first were now stealing glances, trying to understand how a quiet boy in a hoodie could suddenly carry this much weight. He didn't look back at them. He didn't need to. He picked up his phone and unlocked it. A new message from his father had come in. "Stay calm. More people are watching than you think. The plane will still fly, but only on my terms." Owen's lips curled slightly, not a smile, just a small signal of understanding. He typed back. "She apologized. In front of everyone. But she still doesn't get it." "She will," came the reply. "By the end of this flight, she will." Up in the cockpit, Captain Hammond kept one hand on the control panel and the other on the in-flight phone. He was speaking quietly with ground operations, listening to every update. His face remained neutral, but inside he was uneasy. In all his years of flying, he had never received a direct executive hold order, the kind that freezes a departure until the situation is fully evaluated from the top. Flight 672 was still sitting at the gate. The doors hadn't closed, and now, whispers were traveling through the crew like a growing wave. People were speculating. Some wondered if they'd be delayed for hours. Others wanted to know who the boy in 2A really was. In the back rows of economy, a few passengers who had seen the earlier confrontation whispered quietly among themselves. "He's gotta be someone important. They made the attendant bring him back. That never happens. She hit his hand. Did you see that? That was messed up. First she called him out like he snuck in, then tried to play it off. I should have said something. But they hadn't. And now their silence echoed louder than their comments. Meanwhile, Bridget stood frozen in the galley, hands still gripping the edges of the tray. Her breath shallow, her heart racing. She had done what she was told, said what they told her to say. But nothing about it had made her feel better, because deep down, she knew the worst part. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice. And now that choice was waiting to catch up with her, at 30,000 feet. The plane had been fully boarded for nearly 10 minutes, yet it still hadn't moved. Passengers began shifting in their seats, glancing toward the windows, checking the time. A few were growing restless, murmuring about connecting flights and delays. The mood was unsettled, not loud or chaotic, but thick with quiet tension, like everyone could sense that something had happened, even if they didn't know exactly what it was. Owen sat in 2A, legs crossed, posture calm. But beneath that calmness, his thoughts were sharp, every second adding another layer to what he had just experienced. It wasn't just about being told to leave. It was the way she had looked at him, like he was an intruder, like the seat belonged to someone else, someone who didn't look like him. The slap wasn't the worst part. The humiliation was. He reached for his phone again. Another message came in. "I've spoken to the airline board. The delay is on purpose. You'll get to your destination, but she won't be flying again today." He read the message twice, then turned off the screen. 3 rows ahead, an older man in a gray sweater turned and looked at Owen with a strange expression, half guilt, half curiosity. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Owen didn't acknowledge him. He was used to that kind of hesitation. Meanwhile, in the galley, Bridget was pacing in short, tight steps. Her nerves were unraveling faster than she could control them. The more she thought about it, the more it all started to crack. The way the captain had looked at her, the tone in the director's voice, the silence from Taylor. She hadn't just offended a passenger. She had insulted the son of a man who could end her entire career with a single call. She leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. 10 years in the air, and she had never made a mistake like this. Or at least not one that came back to her. She had questioned passengers before, made assumptions, denied upgrades, redirected people who didn't look right for the seat they claimed. No one had ever pushed back, not like this. Her chest tightened. Taylor's voice broke the silence. "They're waiting on you." Bridget looked at her. "Who?" "The captain. The call. Whatever this is. It's not over." Bridget didn't respond. She picked up the in-flight phone with shaking fingers and pressed the line that connected to the cockpit. "This is Bridget." The captain's voice came through low and controlled. "You need to prepare. You'll be leaving the flight when we return to the gate. She felt like the floor had dropped beneath her. What? You're being debriefed. An airline official is already at the terminal. Security will meet you once you're off. You're removing me? She whispered, gripping the edge of the counter. There was a pause. Then came the captain's answer. This came from the top, the airline owner himself. You'll step off and someone else will complete the route. Bridget's stomach flipped. What am I supposed to tell the passengers? You don't need to tell them anything, he said flatly. They already saw enough. Bridget hung up slowly, hand trembling. Taylor didn't say a word. She just stood there, watching with eyes that didn't hold judgment, but didn't offer comfort either. And in seat 2A, Owen leaned his head back, closed his eyes, and let the silence stretch. Let her feel what it was like, to sit in the back of something she once thought she controlled. The plane hadn't even left the ground, but the fallout had already started. Bridget remained frozen near the galley, her back pressed against the narrow wall, heart pounding so loud it drowned out the gentle hum of the cabin. She had always been in control during flights, confident, efficient, respected. But now, she felt none of those things. The quiet murmur of passengers, the occasional chime from seatbelt signs, the rustling of magazines. All of it felt distant. Her world had shrunk into this one moment, this one mistake, now unraveling in full view of everyone. She had convinced herself for years that her judgments were part of the job, that she had a sixth sense for trouble, that noticing who did and didn't belong in first class was part of maintaining order. But this time she hadn't just made a silent assumption. She acted on it, loudly, publicly, and now she was the one being removed, before the plane had even taken off. Taylor handed her a folded piece of paper without a word. Bridget glanced at it. Employee removal protocol, Taylor said quietly. The gate agent is waiting. You have to sign it before you leave. Bridget looked at her in disbelief. You're serious? Taylor didn't answer. She didn't need to. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the crew received final communication. The captain's voice came over the intercom, smooth and rehearsed. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Due to a staffing change, our departure will be slightly delayed. Please remain seated while we make final arrangements. We'll be moving shortly. The announcement was vague on purpose, but it didn't stop the whispers. Staffing change? Who's leaving? What happened? Eyes began to scan the cabin again, and all of them seemed to settle on the same spot, the galley. Bridget could feel it. The shift. The way her authority had vanished in real time. She wasn't the one giving orders anymore. She had become the story. With trembling fingers, she signed the paper Taylor had given her. Her name, once a symbol of experience and control, looked unfamiliar now, scrawled on a form that confirmed her exit. She smoothed her uniform one last time and walked toward the front, her footsteps stiff and reluctant. The first-class curtain was open. Passengers sat quietly, all eyes turning as she approached. Some looked curious, some looked uncomfortable. A few watched with clear satisfaction. They had seen how she'd treated the boy earlier. Now they were watching her pay the price. Owen sat quietly in his seat, earbuds resting in his lap now, not in his ears. His eyes followed her, calm and unreadable. He didn't flinch. He didn't smirk. He just watched. Bridget made the mistake of looking at him. For a second, she saw him not as the kid she tried to remove, but as someone who held more power than anyone else in the cabin. Not because he was wealthy, not because of who his father was, but because he hadn't needed to raise his voice or fight back with noise. His silence had done all the damage. Her breath caught in her throat, but she pushed forward. Past the rows of curious faces, past the curtain, past her career. The main door of the aircraft had reopened, and standing just inside the jet bridge was a security officer in uniform and a woman in a navy blue blazer holding a clipboard. Both were silent as Bridget stepped off the plane. The door shut behind her with a hiss. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere shifted again. Someone exhaled quietly. A woman in business attire glanced at Owen with new eyes. A man across the aisle leaned back, his expression complicated. Part guilt, part respect. Owen adjusted his seatbelt and picked up his book. He hadn't spoken a word since he returned to his seat. But somehow he had changed the course of everything. The door sealed behind Bridget with a final click, leaving a quiet stillness inside the cabin. It wasn't the usual hush of a plane preparing for takeoff. It was heavier, more aware. Everyone had felt the shift. No one said it out loud, but it lingered in the air like something unresolved. A few passengers leaned toward each other, whispering quietly. Others sat straighter in their seats, their attention subtly drawn to the boy in 2A who hadn't said much, but had clearly shaken the balance of power with a single phone call. Owen didn't move. He stayed seated, back straight, one hand resting on his book, the other lightly touching his phone. He didn't want anyone to think he was angry. He wasn't. He was focused, waiting, processing. He had learned early in life that power didn't always mean noise. Sometimes the loudest person in the room had the least control, and sometimes the one who sat still, who waited, was the one people feared most. Taylor came down the aisle slowly, offering water and refreshments, her hands steady but her eyes scanning every face. She paused briefly at Owen's seat. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked softly. He glanced up. "Just water, thanks." She nodded and handed him a glass, her eyes lingering just a second longer before moving on. It wasn't pity in her expression. It was something else, something that looked like respect. In the cockpit, Captain Hammond checked his watch again. The delay had stretched just past the 30-minute mark. That wasn't ideal, but the circumstances had made it unavoidable. The executive orders had come down fast, and when they did, no one in the airline questioned them, not when the man giving them owned nearly everything. "Is the replacement ready?" he asked through the comm line. A voice replied, "Yes, we've got a crew member standing by to fill the role. Door will close in 5. The captain nodded and leaned back in his seat. He had flown across storms, emergency landings, even political crises. But he hadn't seen many moments like this, where a quiet teenager had frozen an entire airline's operations without saying a single threatening word. He adjusted the cabin settings and gave the all-clear to resume takeoff prep. Back in first class, Owen took a sip of the water, his eyes scanning the reflection in the glass. The man sitting across from him, an older gentleman in a dark gray blazer, finally cleared his throat. I saw what happened earlier," he said in a low voice. "It was wrong. All of it." Owen didn't say anything. The man hesitated, then added, "I should have said something when it happened. But I didn't." Owen looked at him. "Why didn't you?" The man fumbled. I wasn't sure it was my place, and to be honest, I didn't think it would escalate." Owen nodded slowly. "That's the thing. It doesn't start as violence. It starts with silence." The words hung in the air between them. The man looked away, visibly uncomfortable, but not angry. Just exposed. Across the aisle, a woman who had earlier avoided eye contact now watched Owen quietly. She didn't say anything either, but her eyes said enough. There was awareness now, a discomfort. Not because of Owen, but because of their own inaction. Meanwhile, in the back of the plane, a few economy passengers who had recorded the confrontation earlier were replaying the video. One leaned toward another and whispered, "You think it'll go viral?" "Probably already is. Should send it to the news." They weren't laughing. They weren't mocking. They were serious. This wasn't just gossip. This had become a moment. Something bigger than the flight. Something that touched nerves. Owen's phone buzzed again. His father had texted, "The footage is out. News agencies are calling. You've made your point. Now sit back. I'll handle the rest." He read it once, then typed back, "She's gone, but I'm not sure she understands why." "She will," came the reply. "Not because we punished her, but because the world is watching now." The final door closed. Engines roared to life, and as the plane finally rolled onto the runway, Owen sat still in his seat, one teenager, surrounded by first-class passengers who now couldn't stop thinking about him. Not because he was rich, not because he was powerful, but because, without raising his voice or lifting a hand, he had changed everything. The plane eased down the runway, its engines humming louder now as it picked up speed. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, a signal for passengers to buckle in and prepare for takeoff. But inside the aircraft, something was still unsettled. It wasn't turbulence. It wasn't fear. It was awareness. A shared realization that the normal flight routine had already been broken. Everyone was pretending to settle back into their seats, yet their eyes kept drifting toward 2A, where Owen sat motionless, head turned slightly toward the window. From the outside, he looked calm, maybe even indifferent, but inside, Owen's thoughts were restless. He didn't want attention. He wasn't the type to seek the spotlight. But he had learned, especially in the last year, that silence sometimes felt like surrender. And this time, he hadn't been willing to stay silent. The slap was only the surface. It wasn't just about being touched or told to move. It was about the feeling behind it. The unspoken assumption that he wasn't supposed to be there, that he didn't look like he belonged, and that, above all, no one would stand up for him. He rested his head lightly against the window as the plane lifted from the ground. City lights below blurred into golden streaks, and for a moment the sound of wheels leaving the earth was the only thing that filled the space around him. But the weight of what had happened was still heavy on his chest. Taylor passed through the aisle again with a soft, practiced voice. She offered drinks and snacks, but when she reached Owen's seat, she paused slightly longer than usual. "Is there anything I can get you?" she asked. He looked at her, then shook his head politely. "No, thank you." She gave a small nod, then leaned in just a little. "You didn't deserve that. I just wanted to say that." Her voice was low enough that no one else could hear. Owen didn't smile, but his eyes softened for a moment. "Thanks." Taylor moved on, but that brief exchange was enough to remind him that not everyone had stayed silent. Some people watched, yes, but some noticed, and sometimes noticing was the first step toward change. Across the aisle, the man in the blazer, the one who had apologized, was now scrolling through his phone. His screen lit up with a news headline. "Teen removed from first-class cabin. Turns out he's the son of major airline owner." The article had just gone live. Beneath the headline, a blurry photo taken from inside the cabin showed Bridget confronting Owen. The angle wasn't clear, but the tension in the image was. The comments had already started pouring in. "He handled it better than I would have." This is exactly why representation matters. The fact that she hit him and still thought she was right? Unbelievable. Respect to the kid for staying calm. Most would have snapped. The man glanced across at Owen again. This time his expression held something new. Not pity, not confusion, but quiet admiration. Owen hadn't said much, hadn't made speeches or demanded anything, but he had stood his ground with silence and dignity. In the galley, Taylor stood with her arms crossed as she read the same article on her own device. She let out a breath and looked around. The other flight attendants were talking quietly amongst themselves, avoiding the topic, but it was all any of them were thinking about. One of them, Melissa, leaned over. "Do you think she'll get fired?" Taylor didn't answer right away. Then she said, "I think what happens next is out of her hands now." They both went quiet. Back in the cabin, Owen reopened his book. But this time he wasn't reading. The words blurred in front of him as he thought about the days ahead. The article would keep spreading. More people would see the footage. His father would speak with the board, maybe make a statement. But even beyond the headlines, something bigger had already happened. People had seen it. Not just the slap, not just the silence, but the way it changed when someone said, "Enough." And maybe, just maybe, someone else would speak up next time, before it went too far. Before another kid sat in the back, quietly waiting for the world to catch up. The plane cruised through the sky now, calm and steady, but inside the air carried something stronger than turbulence. It carried truth, and truth doesn't land quietly. Somewhere over the clouds, at 35,000 feet, the plane leveled out. The seatbelt sign turned off with a quiet ding, and passengers began to relax into the rhythm of the flight. Drinks clinking softly on tray tables, earbuds going in, books opening. But there was still a current running through the cabin, a low pulse that hadn't faded. Even those trying to pretend it was just another flight couldn't quite shake the memory of what had happened before takeoff. Owen didn't move much. He sat with one leg crossed over the other, occasionally glancing at the window, but mostly still. He had checked his phone a few more times. 3 missed calls from media numbers he didn't recognize, and 4 unread emails, all flagged with subject lines like urgent comment request or press inquiry. His father must have forwarded the story to his team by now. Maybe lawyers were already involved. Maybe the airline was drafting a public response. But none of that mattered to Owen right now. He wasn't after revenge. He didn't care about headlines. What stayed with him was the look in Bridget's eyes when she realized who he was. Not because of the power behind his name, but because she suddenly had to see him as a person. That was the part she hadn't expected. And that's what made it worse. Across the aisle, the man in the gray blazer was still checking his phone every few minutes, reading comment threads like they held some kind of answer. 2 rows behind, a woman whispered to her friend. They didn't even check his ticket properly. Can you believe that? No, her friend replied. But I'm not surprised either. In the rear of the cabin, one of the passengers who had filmed the original altercation had posted the clip to social media. The video had already crossed 20,000 views in under an hour. In it, Bridget's voice rang out, "You're holding up the boarding process," followed by the slap, the stunned silence, and Owen standing slowly, backpack in hand. What struck people wasn't just what was said. It was how no one did anything. The way people looked away, the way the cabin fell silent, and then the comments started rolling in. This is what happens when power finally answers back. She didn't expect a kid in a hoodie to have that kind of reach. That calm walk to the back, that was the loudest part. Up in the cockpit, Captain Hammond received another update through his headset. The airline's corporate line had released a temporary internal notice. Flight 672 incident under executive review. Media silence recommended. Await further instruction. He wasn't surprised. He looked out at the horizon. The sky was clear, wide open. But he knew this flight wasn't going to be forgotten anytime soon. In the galley, Taylor leaned back on the counter, sipping water quietly. She'd worked flights with rough passengers, mid-air panic attacks, and even minor emergencies. But this was different. Not because it was chaotic, but because it had been quiet, controlled, and devastating. She kept seeing the way Owen had sat there, not demanding anything, not reacting with anger or pride, just watching. Like he knew that truth didn't need a spotlight, it only needed to be seen. Melissa joined her, shaking her head. "You think she'll fight it?" Taylor raised an eyebrow. "Fight what? The suspension, the investigation, the fact that she's probably done flying." "She might," Taylor said slowly, "but she'd have to admit what she really did first." Melissa sighed. That's the part people never want to say out loud. In seat 2A, Owen received another message from his father. "HR has started the inquiry. They've asked for a full statement. I'll handle it. You just rest." "This might become bigger than we thought." Owen replied with a single line. "Let it. Maybe that's the only way things change." He put the phone away again, folded his hands, and leaned back in his seat. The drink cart moved quietly behind him, but he didn't notice. His thoughts weren't on soda or peanuts. They were on that moment. That one moment. When Bridget had looked at him and assumed. That assumption had cost her everything. And Owen. He hadn't raised his voice once. But now the world was listening. As the flight moved through the sky, steady and uninterrupted, Owen sat with a quiet stillness that unsettled even those who hadn't witnessed the earlier events. The truth was, people couldn't stop thinking about it. Most passengers weren't reading their books anymore. Their movies were paused, untouched drinks resting on folded napkins. The man in the aisle seat across from Owen opened and closed his tablet 3 times in 10 minutes. Every now and then, someone would glance over at Owen, then quickly look away when he shifted slightly in his seat. There was no announcement, no official acknowledgement, but everyone knew something serious had happened. and was still happening beyond the cabin walls. News spreads fast in the air, even when there's no Wi-Fi. Further back in economy, a middle-aged woman opened her Twitter app to see a clip of Owen's quiet removal from first class already trending. The comments flooded her feed. People like her don't lose power often, but when they do, it's always because they thought no one was watching. He didn't scream. He didn't argue. He just exposed the truth, and the whole plane saw it. You can feel how cold that silence was when he walked to the back. The video had passed 80,000 views. One journalist had already tweeted asking for an interview. Another tagged the airline, demanding an official response. The internet, as always, had taken what was meant to be quiet and turned it into a wave. And it was only getting louder. Meanwhile, Owen didn't need to see the screen to know what was happening. His father had warned him once that the power of silence was that it created space for truth to walk in and fill it. That was happening now, all around him. He remembered the expression on Bridget's face before she left the plane. Not regret, not panic. It was the look of someone who had finally been forced to see the mirror, held up not by noise, but by consequence. Taylor returned to the cabin again. She stopped at Owen's seat without speaking right away, resting a hand lightly on the top of the seat across from him. "Sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't say anything sooner." Owen looked at her, his tone calm. "You didn't have to fix it. You just had to see it." She nodded. "I saw it." There was a pause. "People don't usually get called out for that kind of thing," she added. "They hide behind uniforms, rules, rank. You didn't let her." Owen took a breath. "I didn't need to." She looked down the aisle where Bridget had once stood, towering over him. That image now felt like it had happened days ago, not just before takeoff. "Let me know if you need anything," Taylor said softly. "Thank you." When she left, the cabin returned to its heavy quiet. Owen tilted his head back and closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to slow his breathing, to center himself. Across the aisle, the man in the blazer hesitated again, then finally leaned over. "Look," he began, his voice low. "I keep thinking about what happened, about how I just sat there." Owen didn't open his eyes. He just waited. "I think it's easier for people like me to pretend we didn't see it. But the truth is, we did. I did. And I didn't speak up." Owen opened his eyes and looked at the man waiting again. "I'm sorry," the man said, voice tighter now. "It wasn't enough. Watching it happen and then feeling sorry after, it's not enough." "No," Owen replied. "It never is." The man looked down at his lap, ashamed. He wasn't the villain in this story, but he had been a witness. And sometimes, silence can be just as loud as action. At the back of the plane, Taylor stood near the galley again, arms folded. She had just gotten off the radio with the crew coordinator. The inquiry had already begun. Bridget was being debriefed. The airline was officially investigating alleged conduct during boarding. No one said her name, but everyone knew who it was about. Taylor took a deep breath. She had worked with Bridget for 2 years. Bridget had been strict, sometimes cold, always commanding. But Taylor had also seen the small moments, where she used her authority to decide who was worth smiling at, who deserved a welcome aboard, who got her best voice, and who got her cold silence. Owen had gotten the silence, then the slap, then the shove toward the back of the plane. And now justice was trailing close behind. The plane moved forward, slicing through the sky. From the outside, everything looked normal. But inside the walls of this pressurized metal shell, a quiet reckoning was unfolding. Not one of rage or chaos or public shouting, but of truth and exposure. And for once, people were watching. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight attendants began preparing for the next service round. The aisles, once filled with the low murmur of polite conversations, had fallen into a strange, uneasy quiet. People were still talking, but not about their trips or their seat preferences or what drinks to order. They were whispering about the incident, about him, and about her. The teenager in 2A who now carried the weight of a story that had reached thousands of eyes within the span of a single flight, and the flight attendant who had vanished before the plane ever left the ground. Owen adjusted in his seat, stretching one leg out and leaning his head gently against the cushioned window edge. He wasn't tired, but he wanted to give the impression he was. It helped quiet the looks. Still, he could feel them, the sideways glances, the eyes that lingered just a second too long before shifting back to glowing screens or half-read magazines. Everyone had seen him re-enter the first-class cabin. Everyone had watched Bridget walk him back like a student who had just been wrongly sent to detention. And now, every moment that passed without her on board only made the truth clearer. Owen's phone buzzed again. His father had sent another update. The internal email just went out to all crew. The airline's reviewing her full employment record. Public statement in the next few hours. It's officially an investigation now. Then another message seconds later. Your name's trending. I'll try to keep it controlled. Owen sighed, staring at the screen. He didn't want fame. He didn't want headlines. He had never liked attention. His father always warned him that privilege came with a spotlight, one that couldn't always be turned off. He thought he could escape it by flying alone, wearing regular clothes, just being another passenger. But he had learned the hard way that some people didn't need to know your name to decide who you were. They just needed to look at you. Across the cabin, two women leaned toward each other and whispered. That's him. Are you sure? Yes. He's the one. Do you think he'll sue? I would. They weren't malicious, just curious. But Owen heard it all the same. He took another sip of water and placed his phone face down on the tray table. No more updates, no more alerts. The man in the gray blazer, the same one who had apologized earlier, sighed quietly and turned toward Owen once more. You know, he said, voice low and careful, I work in corporate training. We talk about bias all the time. But when you see it happen, when it's real, it looks different. Owen looked at him, not coldly, just neutrally. It always looks different up close. The man nodded slowly. I guess I never thought I'd be one of the people who froze. You weren't the only one, Owen replied. Another pause. Still doesn't make it right, the man added. No, it doesn't. And that was the end of the conversation. In the back galley, Taylor stood with a tablet in her hand, reviewing updates sent through the crew's internal messaging app. Her hands tightened slightly when she read the newest directive. All cabin crew reminded to review anti-discrimination policy. Mandatory training sessions scheduled. All incidents involving cabin conduct to be logged and reported immediately. Below it, a private message blinked from her supervisor. Keep an eye on first class. Let us know if anything escalates. Taylor sighed and set the tablet down. Nothing was escalating, but everything was shifting. The balance of control had changed. The cabin didn't feel the same anymore. She walked slowly back into first class. Her eyes scanned the passengers, many now restless or staring blankly ahead. Then her gaze landed on Owen. He was scrolling through his messages again, his face unreadable, his movements slow, deliberate. She approached and crouched down just enough so her voice wouldn't carry. Just so you know, she said gently, people are still talking, but not the way you might think. Owen looked at her. They're not questioning what happened, Taylor continued. They're questioning why they didn't see it sooner, why it had to get this far before anyone paid attention. He blinked slowly. Most people saw you and assumed you'd walk away. That you'd let it go, she added. You didn't. Owen didn't reply, but she could see in his eyes that he understood. He wasn't proud. He wasn't angry. He was just resolved. Taylor stood and moved on. The plane hummed through the sky, but the silence wasn't just from altitude. It was the kind of silence that comes after a reckoning. A pause before the consequences arrive. And though no one said it aloud, everyone knew. This flight was no longer just a flight. It was a message, one that wouldn't be forgotten. The hours in the air passed slowly, but they weren't quiet, not on the inside. Most passengers had settled into the routines of a long flight. blankets pulled up to their chins, eyes closed but not asleep, headphones playing music too low to be heard. But even behind closed eyes, their minds were turning. Every time a flight attendant passed by, every time a tray shifted or a passenger stood up to stretch, someone's thoughts circled back to what had happened before the wheels left the ground. Owen hadn't spoken in nearly 40 minutes. He had put his phone away, letting it sit untouched next to a glass of melted ice and untouched soda. His book lay closed on his lap now. He had stopped pretending to read. Instead, he simply watched, silently observing the reactions of those around him, the glances that flicked toward him, then away, the way people sat straighter when he shifted in his seat, how they acted like he wasn't the same boy they had watched walk to the back of the plane just hours earlier. He was. They weren't. They had changed, because now they knew. And once you know, you can't unknow it. In seat 3C, the woman in a white blazer had finally decided to speak. She leaned toward Owen's seat, her tone soft and careful. "Can I say something?" she asked. Owen turned toward her. "You just did." She gave a quiet smile. "Right. I've been watching, not in a creepy way," she added quickly, "but in a reflective way. You handled yourself with more grace than most grown adults I've ever seen." Owen said nothing, waiting. "I didn't stand up either," she continued. "I heard everything. I saw her face when she spoke to you. I saw yours too. And I just sat there. I guess I told myself it wasn't my place. But it was. It always is," Owen said gently. "Silence protects the one who's loudest." She nodded slowly. "I won't be silent again." It wasn't a dramatic moment. There was no tearful apology, just quiet truth. Honest, simple. That was all Owen ever wanted. Not grand speeches, not forced forgiveness. Just honesty. A few rows back, the businessman in the navy tie had opened his laptop again, but this time not to scroll through contracts. Instead, he was typing a LinkedIn post. "Today I watched a young man stand taller than anyone on this plane, and he never once raised his voice. I saw bias, I saw silence, I saw consequence. But what struck me most was the control, the dignity, the quiet power. That kind of leadership can't be taught in boardrooms. It's lived." He stared at the screen for a few seconds before hitting post. Back near the galley, Taylor was finishing her crew report, something usually filled with inventory notes and seatbelt compliance checkmarks. But this time, it had a new section, Incident Summary, filed voluntarily. Passenger in seat 2A was publicly removed from first class without proper verification of boarding credentials. The crew member responsible failed to follow identification procedures, used dismissive language, and escalated the encounter with physical contact. Passenger remained calm and compliant throughout. Incident resulted in immediate removal of crew member from flight by executive order. Recommend full investigation and review of internal training protocols. She signed her name at the bottom, slid the tablet into its charging dock, and exhaled. It felt right. Maybe it wouldn't fix everything, but it was a start. Her conscience felt lighter. At the front of the cabin, Owen looked down at his hands. They were steady, clean, resting in his lap, not clenched, not nervous. He knew what he had done, and he knew what Bridget had done too. He also knew what the airline would try next. Damage control, polite statements, maybe even compensation offers. But no press release could erase the moment she looked at him and saw a threat instead of a passenger. He didn't want her fired. Not really. But he wanted her to understand that the damage wasn't in the slap. It was in the way no one stopped her. He leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. A final message buzzed softly on his phone. His father again. "Statement goes live in 20 minutes. You'll be asked if you want to speak publicly. You don't have to. But if you do, I'll stand beside you. No pressure." Owen stared at the message for a long moment. Then he typed, "Let's talk. But I don't want it to be about me. I want it to be about everyone who's ever been told to move quietly to the back." I just happened to have a seat they couldn't ignore. He hit send. Outside the plane, the horizon was beginning to shift. The sky held a glow now, soft, faint, but undeniable. Morning was coming, and so was landing. So was everything else. The early light of dawn crept through the windows, painting the cabin in a pale silver hue. One by one, passengers stirred from their uneasy sleep or half-hearted distractions. The mood hadn't lightened. If anything, the stillness of the morning only made the tension clearer. Every person on board knew they were approaching the end of the flight, but not the end of the story. The captain's voice broke the silence. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent shortly. Please make sure your seat belts are fastened, tray tables are up, and personal items are secured. We'll be landing on schedule. Thank you. The intercom cut off with a quiet click, but it left behind an echo. A sense that this was the beginning of something, not the close. Owen fastened his seatbelt without looking up. His hands moved automatically, his body practiced in routine. But his mind was somewhere else. Not in the clouds or on the runway, but on what waited at the gate. He didn't need a welcome party. He didn't want cameras or flashing lights or a row of suited executives pretending to care. All he wanted was the truth to follow through, to land with him and stay grounded. As the plane descended, the engine's hum deepened and the tension in the cabin thickened again. People straightened their seats and adjusted their posture, but their focus remained on him. Not because he asked for it, but because they knew what they had seen and hadn't stopped. In row 4, a mother quietly explained to her daughter what had happened before takeoff. Her words were soft, but clear. Sometimes people treat others badly because of how they look, and when no one speaks up, it gets worse. But that boy over there, he didn't stay quiet. The girl, maybe 10 years old, looked past her mother's shoulder at Owen, wide-eyed. She didn't say anything. She just stared. Owen caught the glance, nodded once gently. The kind of nod you give when someone needs to know that it's okay to see it. In the galley, Taylor adjusted her uniform and smoothed her collar, preparing for landing. But her mind wasn't on safety checks or passenger reminders. It was still with the earlier moment, Bridget's silence as she walked off the plane, the way the cabin shifted after, and the conversations that followed. She had worked over 60 flights that year, but she knew this one would stay with her. The intercom dinged again as the captain gave final instructions. Flight attendants made their way through the cabin with practiced ease, but there was a new edge in their movements, like they knew that every gesture was being measured. Owen sat still. His phone buzzed again. Another message from his father. Security and PR team are at the gate. Everything's being handled. They'll wait to speak with you if you're ready. No cameras like you asked. He replied, let them wait. I'm not leaving until the last passenger is off. He wanted to see the faces, the ones who watched, the ones who whispered, the ones who turned away, not to punish them, but to remind them that presence has power. The wheels touched down with a soft jolt. The plane slowed, brakes hissing, engines humming lower. A few passengers clapped instinctively, then stopped, unsure if it was appropriate. The usual cheer that came with safe arrival felt misplaced now. The plane taxied toward the gate. Owen stared straight ahead. The woman in white beside him pulled out her phone, opened her notepad app, and began typing. He didn't look over. He didn't need to know what she was writing. He had already said everything without saying much at all. Behind him, passengers were already collecting their things, shuffling awkwardly in the aisle, glancing toward the front of the cabin where ground staff waited just beyond the still-closed door. Then the seatbelt sign turned off. There was a pause. People hesitated. Usually, passengers rushed to grab bags, unbuckle seatbelts, and line up near the exit before the door even opened. But now they moved slower. Deliberate. Like they were waiting for something more than just the landing announcement. One by one, they stepped out of their rows, walked past Owen's seat, and exited. Some nodded at him. Some looked away. A few whispered, "Thank you." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. Row by row, the plane emptied, until only Owen remained, still seated, still watching, and waiting for the world to catch up. The cabin was empty now. The chatter, the shuffling, the soft thuds of bags being pulled from overhead bins, all of it had faded into silence. Every seat was bare. The aisle was clear. The plane, which hours ago had carried whispers, judgment, discomfort, and awakening, now felt like a sealed echo chamber, holding the final breath of something unfinished. Owen remained in seat 2A, upright, steady. His hands rested on his lap, fingers loosely folded, his posture calm, unshaken. The silence wasn't awkward. It was purposeful. Every second he stayed in that seat meant something. It said, "I'm not rushing out of here. I'm not escaping. I have nothing to hide." Taylor stood a few feet ahead, near the cockpit door, watching him quietly. She hadn't said a word since the last passenger stepped off. She hadn't needed to. In the hours since boarding, something inside her had shifted. She had gone from routine to awareness, from bystander to witness. And now, as she watched Owen sit alone in the front of the aircraft he had once been thrown out of, her throat tightened. He looked at her and gave the smallest nod. She returned it, and for the first time in her career, she felt the meaning of what it meant to be part of a crew, not just to ensure safety or hand out snacks, but to stand in moments that mattered. The door to the jet bridge opened again with a soft hiss. 3 people entered. A tall man in a black overcoat, a younger woman with a clipboard, and a third in a gray suit with a badge pinned to his lapel. All of them moved respectfully, slowly, as if entering a room that didn't belong to them. The man in the coat approached first. "Owen, my name's Grant. I'm with Public Relations. First, I want to say there's no excuse for what happened on this flight." Owen looked at him but didn't speak. Grant continued, choosing his words carefully. "The flight attendant involved has been removed from duty indefinitely. An internal review is in progress. We're releasing a formal apology to the public. We'll also be revisiting our internal training, policies, and conduct evaluations. Not just because of this, but because it's long overdue." The woman with the clipboard added, "We understand if you choose not to speak publicly. But if you do, we'll support whatever message you want to send." Owen studied their faces, polished, controlled, sincere maybe, but also careful. They were managing a crisis. He understood that. But he also saw something else. Shame. Not for what they had done personally, but for what they had ignored for so long. He finally spoke, voice even and low. "I'm not interested in being a headline." Grant started to respond, but Owen cut in. "But I do want something changed, not just a public statement, not just one person removed. I want every employee who wears your uniform to understand what it means when someone like me gets treated like I don't belong. I want that training you're promising to be more than a box they check. And I want you to say it, not just to me, but to everyone who watched this happen and said nothing, because silence was the loudest part of this flight." No one spoke. Then Owen stood. He reached for his backpack and slowly slung it over one shoulder. The leather strap creaked slightly under his grip. He glanced around the cabin one last time. "This was never just about me," he said. "It was about all the people who've been moved to the back without ever being asked for a ticket. All the ones who didn't have someone powerful to call." Grant swallowed hard. "We hear you." Owen gave a nod and stepped past them. Taylor stood aside, her eyes following him as he made his way to the exit. He paused for a second, turned slightly toward her, and said just one thing. "You didn't say much, but you saw it, that matters." And then he walked off the plane, out into the corridor, into the light of morning. No cameras, no applause, just the quiet weight of a story that would now live far beyond a seat number, a boarding pass, or a cabin class. Inside the plane, the silence remained, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with what had been said, what had been shown, and what would never be forgotten. Because some flights take you farther than the destination printed on a ticket, and some passengers never go unnoticed again. If this story moved you, make sure to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories.